The title to this video is obviously clickbait, and before you say, oh wow, how clever, no, it's not clever at all. That's the point that I'm trying to make here. It's not clever, the title is not clever, it's something that everyone knows. It's something that's already very clear, but what we haven't discussed is why is this the case. So today we're going to be getting into that in particular. So let's talk about the origins of psychology and biology when it comes to the idea of clickbait, of drama, and why politics nowadays has kind of become the amalgamation of everything that is wrong with the psychological biology that is pertaining to the social endeavors. No matter what religion you have to admit that there is an inherent need for survival within the human race. Within any living thing, it wants to stay alive. It's the will that it has. And whether you say it's because of evolution or because of just this survival instinctual thing by a god or whatever, it doesn't matter. Because you come up with the same consequence, which is that you want to survive. Now, wanting to survive means you need to be ready to fight, which means you need to be able to withstand the stress. One of the survival mechanisms is adrenaline, and this is also the thing that people get when they're in fights, what people get when they're doing intense sports. It's this kind of thing, that basically controls you in a situation where it's fight or flight, where you have to survive, right? Okay, so, but what happens when there's a society where the things that are the true battles are no longer physical battles, are no longer just fighting? What happens when they kind of go into, let's say, the intellectual fields? Because let's be honest, we've become more intellectual, especially in the Western civilization. We've become more intellectual over the past few centuries. It's why we're so advanced, so clean, so much better. Why our politics and our philosophies and our science have just always been getting better since the mid-end of the 15th century. And that is something that has to do a lot with the thing that we're also lacking right now, which is talking about interest in survival. See, back in the day, in the 1800s, for example, during Napoleon's reign, let's say that, right? During Napoleon's reign, Europe was very much at war with everyone, like with themselves, with each other. It was pretty intense. And the idea that there was this thing that's different from now and then is false. We don't deal with anything differently. It's still the same dichotomy, which is, of course, the idea of a duality, the idea of one thing versus another thing, which is usually the East versus the West, right? Christianity versus Islam, religion versus atheism, red versus blue. It's a very simplistic way of thinking. But that goes back to the tribal idea of survival. So, what has changed is that there's no longer a need for the intellectual education. So what is happening is that people have become lazy because they're comfortable, right? We have used our education to become more advanced, and we've used advancements to lead a better life. But the byproduct of that better life has been that we've become lazier, that we've become, more willing to just let things go. We've become lax, right? So, how do we reinvigorate that interest when people don't want to be interested in politics? When people don't want to be interested in the heavy subjects? Because when they are, it takes over a lot of their life, and we'll get into that later, the details of that. But that is the truth. Again, this video is not to talk about one particular side of politics. This video is talking about the idea of sides in politics and how it's kind of become a problem and how it's created these other problems as well. So of course, it starts with education. Now, with gemtocracy, for example, we have an idea for a new education system called alpha alletropy. And it's going to be focused on a lot of different things. And then, you're going to be asking yourself, of course, but who's going to be controlling it? Because there's always this idea of control versus expression, the self-identification, the self-expression versus the other people trying to tell you what you should be doing, what you can't be doing. And there are, of course, people who say that there is a balance that's more to the one side or the other side. But the ultimate problem that you're dealing with in this dichotomy of thinking, is that expression and control should not be seen as separate things. If there's no one to control the situation, then you can't express yourself. Because let's say that there's a neo-Nazi and a Marxist liberal, right? Let's say that those two are clashing with each other, two very extreme ways of thinking, right? Let's say that they kind of just clash with each other and they beat each other's skull in because no one's there to tell them that they can't do that. Well, that's the problem that you're dealing with at that moment. Because then you have no way to express yourself because there's no security. There's no one, because you can't just rely on the goodwill of people. The people are inherently not evil or good, but they are inherently survivalist. They inherently want to survive. And there are strengths in numbers, but there are moments where people in the moment don't see that. And that's when you get these issues, right? That's when these issues prevail as well, where they grow, where they kind of fester, if you know what I'm saying. And this leads us to the next problem, which is, of course, the information capacity problem. Because when you have information, you can only retain a certain amount of information throughout your life. And if you're already in like a position where you have to survive on your own with bills or whatever, in the Western world, that's like the biggest concern is like paying your bills, getting your children to school, fucking your wife, stuff like that. That's just what that is, right? Now, when you do these things, when you live your life, there are certain things you might not be interested in because they just don't apply to you. Like I said before, if there's no interest in something from a young age, if it's not taught to people to have interest and how to cope with a lot of information, then they can't have a lot of information. And that's the real issue that we're dealing with, right? Because that's the information capacity problem. You can't retain too much information because you're already too stressed about other things, or someone's entire ideology is hard to put into a few words, so you might not have the time to do that. So that's why we should have the ability to make time to kind of teach people at a young age a lot of things and have those things kind of attach themselves to metaphors, attach themselves to smaller stories, so that people can kind of talk about these stories, right? Name one word, for example, the name of a story. Like if I say metamorphosis, right? Your mind might instantly go to that little novel about the person who turned into a bug, right? That's it, and there's like a lot to attach to that. So that's the kind of thing that I'm talking about. So, but here comes, of course, the next question. So if we have an information capacity problem and we need to try to word that into just a few words, we need to first define what is an ideology, right? What is an ideology? An ideology is a way of living, of course, but it's a way of thinking. It's a collection of ideas. This is why religions are also an ideology. And you've got a political ideology, but you've also got a philosophical ideology. Because ideology stands for ideas, basically, is the idea. And now we need to, of course, ask ourselves, okay, so if an ideology needs to be put into a few words, and we need to explain it to people, how will those ideas then spread amongst those people? And they will, of course, mutate. And some people might say it's like a virus or bacteria, but I like to compare ideas more so to electrons. there's this principle called the uncertainty principle, and you may be familiar with it, but you may not. I'm just going to quickly explain it in case you don't know what it is. It's the idea that electrons, which are basically signatures, an energy signature around a nucleus, which is kind of like a small particle. It's really small, and around it is a negatively charged electron, or several, basically. But they're not really in one place. And the uncertainty principle works the same way that ideas do, I think. In the sense that ideas can move and shift and connect and kind of like work like electrons do. They can bind together to form molecules, which then form bigger things like trees or your desk or whatever, right? So consider that, right? Consider that idea. Then you have to ask yourself, of course, what kind of element are we trying to create? And there was a little fly, sorry. It needs to get out of my way. Thank you. But, right, you need to ask yourself, what will this mean for the world that we live in our current political climate around the world, globally, but as well as in the Americas and in Europe especially, which is where gemtocracy is mostly focused. But it counts for all across the board, right? Which is, of course, where does it go wrong with the ideas? And I see it like this, right? If there's a configuration in electrons that makes it so that an element cannot be suitable, it cannot be stable, then if it's an unstable molecule, an unstable atom, right? That kind of becomes the core focus. And it's what I like to call the problem, or the big problem. Big problem, right? So what the big problem really is the idea that one thing is more important than everything else, because it's being regurgitated, because it's the thing that is, of course, a big problem, but it becomes the sole focus. So we talk about things like immigration, right? Which is a very heavily charged topic, and the same goes for climate, abortion, transgenderism, things like that. And if you're more interested in my ideas on what all of these things, you can check out one of my books. I've got my political ideology book, of course, but I've also written a generational book, which is about generations. It's a philosophy book. It's called The Cursed Generation. Just look it up, The Cursed Generation, by Salvator Draco and Marijn, or Lord Salvator Draco and Marijn, and you will find it. I will also link it in the description. Same for the Manifesto for Gemtocracy. So, now, this is where the real issue comes to a head. Why are people currently not doing this? Why is the solution not already being implemented? And that's because people are disillusioned with the truth. And I'm not talking about like the truth as a thing. I'm talking about like the truth as an idea, not as what the truth is, but rather the truth as an idea. People are disillusioned with it because they don't know what to trust anymore. With things like AI, with things like people photoshopping very early on, what is real and what isn't? And you might have overheard something, but then it turns out that wasn't real, and you've been regurgitating the same thing as well, and just saying it over and over again, and now you don't know what is true anymore. It makes you disillusioned. And this goes back to the thing, if it's not necessary for survival, then that's not what people focus on most of the time. Alright, people focus on the things that are really important to them. And we've created a climate where the truth is no longer important, because if it is important, right, if the truth is important, then that means that you have to put in so much effort which you can't do. Right? And that's what needs to change. So the solution to this all is in the education at a young age. It's to teach young people how to use metaphors. It's to teach young people how to make big ideas smaller, and how to connect ideas. How to create a network, a web of ideas. And that's how you form ideologies as well. And in a sense, everyone has their own ideology, their own set of philosophical religious, scientific, belief systems. And some things, are true, some things might not be, but you do the best you can, and you shouldn't feel guilty for that. So it doesn't matter who you vote for or whatever like that, in the sense that if you can't sit opposite of one another and understand at least that you're both basically victims of a system that no one really created, but that just kind of created itself by accident, but just needs to be course corrected. If you can't do that, then I hope your children can. Because I know that it's hard for you. I know that it's hard. And good things take time. So, thank you for watching. All hail to the rebel. Subscribe. Leave a like. And share this video. Maybe?